And now Bill is going to help us understand how to go about getting content into a variety of formats that can make it accessible to a wide audience. Bill?
Hi, folks. I first want to start out by making a kind of a clear distinction between the terms access and accessibility, because they're often confused, particularly in this publishing sector. So we talk about access, it's really generally about discovering, locating, obtaining, and consuming our publications. We talk about accessibility, it's about making publications able to be consumed by those with disabilities. They're not the same thing. My presentation is mainly about accessibility, but that means that it is about access too. The reaction I get, particularly in scholarly publishing, it looks about like this, like, wait a minute, I thought you were talking about access. I really care about that. We're working hard on that. Accessibility, not so much. And then I often, because nobody disputes that it's important, right? So basically, the problem is, yeah, we know we should be doing something about it, but we just don't have the bandwidth or the resources or the budget right now to do this, right? So, sounds good maybe later. That's an old STML joke. I'm here to ask you to stop thinking about accessibility as a burden and start thinking of it as a benefit. Start thinking of it not as a lot of extra work that you have to do that you don't get any return for, and realize that by doing it, you're making your publications better and you're making them better for everybody. So I'm actually going to make a case for this, so stick with me on this. The reason is that most of what accessibility requires today is what you're already doing if you've got a good workflow. And that's because it's based on standards that we use all the time and that our vendors know how to use. This has not always been the case. This is a fairly recent development that we've got this kind of standards alignment across the ecosystem so that the things that we already do are the things that we're supposed to be doing for accessibility, and most people don't realize that. So the foundation, basically this is not going to be a technical speech. I have 10 minutes. There's no way I can get into technicalities. So this is the most obscure stuff you'll see. But the foundation is really the web accessibility standards, and there's kind of two big buckets there. There's what's called WCAG, which is Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and YARIA, which is, the difference is that WCAG is all about how content and systems need to be accessible to everybody. And what ARIA provides is typically most relevant to publishing is it gives you a vocabulary that you can embed in your publications that assistive technology is designed to work with, so that people that can't see the content, for example, a screen reader will navigate that content properly for them. And then for interchanging publications, the standard is EPUB Accessibility 1.0, came out about a year ago. You'll find both of these on the w3.org website, their W3C publications. And EPUB accessibility is based on WCAG and YARIA. So the same things that you need to do, for example, to make your websites accessible are what you should be able to do to make your journal articles or your books accessible as well. I'm just going to go through what the basics are. So first of all, meaningful structure. It used to, the requirement for accessible publications used to involve a specialized vocabulary called DT book, often referred to as the DAISY format. And so people had to find somebody that knew what the heck that was and spend the money to put their content into this very special vocabulary in order for assistive technology to work with it. That's no longer the case. Assistive technology now wants HTML markup. The inherent structural semantics that are built into the HTML vocabulary are what your content should be, and guess what? You already do that. You already know how to do that. Those tags, those HTML tags, and also the ARIA tags that supplement them are what assistive technology is designed to work with, so that the reader that's, for example, using a screen reader knows when something is a new chapter or a block quote or a list, etc., because it's got that markup. It requires a logical reading order. Oh, one thing I should have said on the previous one is one of my main messages today is that scholarly publishing is this close already to just being perfectly accessible. The structural markup I was talking about, yes, we all use JATs, and most of us in books use bits. That's extremely rich, granular, specific markup. It's completely trivially easy to transform that to the HTML vocabulary that assistive technology needs. You've already got the rich markup in your content. You don't have to do it over. Same thing with logical reading order. Some sectors of publishing, in some sectors, this is a big issue. So a complex four-color textbook, for example, has all kinds of things going on visually in the layout of those books. And putting that into an accessible form so that the non-sighted user can navigate properly through it is a challenge. But a journal article is very simple to navigate. It's not a problem. And most scholarly monographs are also very simply structured, and they've got a TOC, which is also an important accessibility feature. So you're pretty much where you need to be already on the logical reading order issue. And another thing that's a big hang-up in a lot of other areas of publishing is that if there's math, assistive technology wants MathML. Well, this is the reason this is controversial is that EPUB reading systems right now mess up your MathML. So most publishers don't actually put the MathML in their EPUBs. They put images of the math in the EPUBs. However, almost all STM content, journal or book content, if it has math in it, the math is MathML at some point in the workflow. It's just upstream. It doesn't get down to out to the final user. It's how the math is used. It's how the math is created by the vendors. I formerly was with one of the big vendors. One of our customers was PLOS, so that's one journal, millions of equations in PLOS 1. All of them are MathML as soon as those manuscripts come to the door, in the door, that math is turned into MathML, and all the math that you see, any way you're rendering any PLOS content was MathML upstream. So you already have the MathML, you may just not realize you have it. And, you know, so now those issues are things that you have very little to do to make this accessible. And why is that an issue? Well, because when you give a PDF to most colleges and universities have what are called DSOs, Disability Services Offices, that are charged with taking content, typically a PDF or something, and making it accessible for a student that needs it to use assistive technology. And it's incredibly laborious, and it's incredibly expensive, and it delays the student getting her book until she's behind the rest of the students, et cetera. Just giving those offices what you've already got with good structure, good navigation, and MathML cuts their work. Jamie Alexander's Axelrod is a friend of mine that's head of the national organization of those offices, and he said that getting EPUBs instead of PDFs would reduce their work by 80%. And even for a heavy STM math content, it would reduce their work by 50%. That's not doing anything that you're not already doing, right? If you can provide HTML and EPUB, that's even better. But the content you have already is pretty much, has what you need. So on the subject of access, I've just got 3 examples here. One is curb cuts. I happen to have an image of a person with a stroller. It's a long time since I had to push the stroller. But I pull suitcases a lot, and I really appreciate those curb cuts. You probably realize that the reason we have curb cuts is because of disability. That's an accessibility feature. That's why those were created in the first place, is for accessibility. How about closed captioning? Thanks for laughing. In a bar, in an airport, being able to follow along on the screen in a noisy place, closed captioning, we take it for granted. It was created for accessibility in the first place. We're now benefiting from that. Here's my last example is voice recognition. It's become commonplace today. In fact, it's so commonplace that Alexa is sending messages out without our even knowing it because she's listening to us. But it's ubiquitous. It was created for accessibility in the first place. That's how that technology was invented. We're just using it, right? So these advances, these things that accessibility requires to make content able to be accessed by everybody makes it better for everybody. So the fundamental principles for web accessibility standards are that content must be perceivable, the interfaces to the content must be operable. Anybody has to be able to operate it. So for example, I was privy to a media player audit recently, and one of the flaws in this media player was that there were no keyboard equivalents to operate it. It had really good accessibility features, but to operate it, you had to click on buttons and things, right? Well, you have to have keyboard equivalents for that because a blind person can't see the button and doesn't know where to click and can't use the mouse, right? So that's a really important issue that's often not thought about by publishers yet. Content and controls must be understandable, and then the content must be robust so that as technology changes, it still works, right? So those are real basic principles for accessibility. Isn't it obvious that those are things that make your content better anyway? Anybody would want the content in their systems to work that way. Here's the one thing that is actually extra work. I don't want to sound like I'm saying, hey, you don't have to do anything, you're already accessible. There is work involved. It's just way less work than you think. One thing is image descriptions. And so you're probably familiar with the term alt text. What that's supposed to convey is what the image is there for. What's it trying to communicate? What does it communicate to a sighted user, right? So in my consulting work, I do a lot of analysis and markup and that sort of thing. So I see lots of files. You wouldn't believe how often I see alt equals quote, quote, or alt equals image. The reason those are there is that it's not legal HTML. HTML, if you have an image tag, it has to have an alt attribute. So people put an alt attribute in, but it's a meaningless alt attribute. It does nothing, right? Or they think they're being helpful by putting the file name of the image in there. It's like, give me a break. Think about what that means. This blind user is using a screen reader, and it reads some stupid file name to them that's not only useless, it's incredibly annoying, or the figure number. Another common mistake is to put the caption in the alt text. That's a no-no, because the screen reader already read the caption to the person, and now it's reading it to her again. So anyway, or just say alt equals bar chart. That's real helpful. No, it's what's the bar chart there for? What's it trying to communicate? Again, in some sectors of publishing, this is a pretty big issue and a real barrier. But I'm making the case that in scholarly publishing, it should be a no-brainer that the author should just supply the image descriptions with the images with the article, right? Because the author knows why that image is in the paper or in the book. And even more so, because it's there for a particular scientific or scholarly purpose, and the audience is typically peers, right? Other researchers are reading that paper. So that author knows exactly what he or she is trying to communicate to those other researchers about that image. They're the right one to write the image description. Now, they may not do it in what the accessibility community would think is the best way, but that's the way to capture the content. And guess what? We know how to copy edit. We do that all the time. So you just copy edit the images. University of Michigan Press is doing this, by the way. It's a small press, a small university press, small to medium-sized university press. But they now have a requirement in their author contracts that the authors provide the image descriptions. And how hard would it be for our manuscript submission and peer review systems when an author puts the manuscript into that system and puts the images in easily enough to provide a field to say, type the description here, right? You're good to go. You still probably have to copy edit it. So anyway, one last thing, and I'm running out of time, is accessibility metadata. So there's two types of metadata. One describes the nature of the accessibility of the publication, which is how can you access it, what kind of accessibility features does it have, are there any accessibility hazards, usually a human readable description of the accessibility, and then what access mode is sufficient to consume this publication. So for example, if you've got text and the images have alt text, then a textual way of consuming it is sufficient, which means a screen reader will be fine, a blind user can use this. And when we developed this vocabulary for this accessibility metadata in the EPUB context, we did it in collaboration with schema.org, so it's identical vocabulary in schema.org and in the EPUB spec. And then lastly, there's a distinction in the EPUB spec in terms of how compliant is it. One is, at least it's got that metadata so you know what you're dealing with. The other is it actually meets the accessibility 1.0 requirements, which is, has the metadata, it meets the WCAG requirements, and it meets the EPUB requirements, and then optimized because it's perfectly legitimate, for example, to create a file that's optimized for Braille. It doesn't do everything else that the accessibility requirement specifies, but it would be ludicrous to say it fails the accessibility when it's deliberately created for Braille. So, in conclusion, structured content is easy to map to HTML, and we've got structured content already. Documents are generally simple and easy to navigate in scholarly publishing. We've almost always got MathML. It seems like a no-brainer for us to get image descriptions from the authors, and the metadata is simple. So let's just get this done. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. I think we have an idea now of some of the things that we can do and some of the things we perhaps shouldn't be doing. And I thought maybe we could take some questions now. Do we have any questions for any of the panelists? No? Over there. Where? I'm not sure. Oh, there you go. That helps. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Nancy Goff. I'm the owner of Bioserendipity, which is a small consulting firm. I was an editor with AAAS for 17 years before that. I had a comment for Michael Roy and also for just everybody here. One of the things we might want to collect in terms of social media is Twitter handles for our authors, especially for our first authors who tend to be the younger people. And then if you do have any opportunities to tweet or retweet, including their university handle and their Twitter handle, will rapidly allow them to retweet that and see it. So that's one thing I would recommend publishers start collecting along with their ORCID IDs is Twitter handles if they're available. And then my other comment was for our last speaker, Mr. Kastorf. We tried to do this when I was with AAAS, and honestly, we found it really, well, the last part, the image tagging, the image describing.
Image descriptions, yep.
And I now write a blog, and I do all of this, and I try to make sure that I'm describing the images well enough. But honestly, I find it very challenging to know exactly what I should be describing in a data figure. It's easy to say, it's a woman jumping off a diving board into a swimming pool. It's a photograph of someone jumping off a diving board into a swimming pool.
Yeah.
That's easy. A figure of a multi-panel bar chart with little diagrams of the flies moving in different directions and different colors. I don't even know how to begin to describe that so someone else could visualize it.
There is help for that.
And this is why I think it would be very challenging to ask authors to supply it.
Yeah.
I don't think they're going to understand what you're looking for.
Yeah, so let me explain. First of all, I only had 10 minutes. I did a 1-hour webinar on this, so I went into much more detail. But an organization called Benetech has a resource called POET, which is basically trains people how to do image descriptions properly, and they've got a huge library of examples of bar charts, any kind of graphic charts, et cetera. A lot of it is scientific content, and good examples of how to do this. It tends to be science-oriented or STM-oriented. So Michigan, I mentioned, is doing a good job of this. They're mainly a humanities social science publisher, but what they did is they took the resources from Benetech and simply substituted typically humanities images, and it's actually worked for them. So they're getting authors to provide the image descriptions, and they've also trained their own staff to understand how the image description should be done. So it is not trivial. That's why I said that's the one thing that is in fact extra work. But if you're just saying, I'll just try to do this without learning how to do it, it's going to be very frustrating. And just, it's shocking to me that nobody seems to know about these Benetech resources that are out there. It's a nonprofit, it's a Silicon Valley nonprofit, totally free, totally open. They also have something called MathML Cloud that automatically does all kinds of accessible math for you. If you upload your equations, you get accessible versions back. So check out Benetech.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions? I hope this gave you some idea of how to use some different approaches to raise your visibility, and I'd like to thank the panelists for their time and effort.